My name is Audrey Lane. I am 34 years old. And at my cousin Tessa's wedding rehearsal dinner, in front of 38 people, my Aunt Pamela raised her wine glass, looked directly at me, and said that I look up dead people for strangers on the internet for money, and that the family generally tries not to bring it up in polite company. The table laughed. Not unkindly, exactly. The easy laugh of people who have decided, collectively and over years, that something about you is faintly embarrassing and have simply stopped questioning whether the joke is fair. I did not correct her. I have learned, across a decade in this profession, that the moment to correct a misunderstanding about what I do is almost never the moment someone is using that misunderstanding to get a laugh at a rehearsal dinner. 6 weeks later, an estate attorney named Marcus Whitlow called my office at Briarwood Genealogy and Probate Research in Charleston with a routine heir search case involving an unclaimed inheritance, no family connection that he was aware of. No reason to think the file would ever touch my own last name. It touched my own last name within 4 days. My grandfather, Theodore Lane, died in October. He was 84 years old, and he had spent the last 6 decades of his life as the kind of man everyone in our family described, with a certain proud finality, as a self-made success. He built a regional construction supply business from a single truck in 1966 into a company with 11 locations across South Carolina by the time he sold it in 2004. What nobody in my family described him as, because nobody in my family knew, was a man who had been married once before he married my grandmother. I want to walk you through exactly how I found that out, because the way I found it had nothing to do with my own family at all, and everything to do with the profession my Aunt Pamela had just spent a wedding rehearsal dinner making fun of. But before I go any further, welcome to Velvet Revenge Stories. This channel is for women whose careers got reduced at family gatherings to a punchline, who built something real, something technical, something that requires actual training and judgment, and watched it get flattened into a hobby with an invoice. If your work has ever been the joke at someone else's table, this one is for you. Drop a comment below, subscribe, and stay with me. Because what happened over the following 4 months is the most precise thing my profession has ever done for me, and it happened entirely by accident. Here is what I actually do for a living. I am a forensic genealogist and certified heir search researcher. I specialize in what the industry calls intestate succession cases. Situations where someone dies without a clear will, or with a will that doesn't account for the full picture of who is legally entitled to inherit. And an estate attorney or probate court needs someone to reconstruct a family tree with enough rigor to survive legal challenge. This is not, whatever my aunt believes, looking up dead people on the internet. It requires a working knowledge of vital record systems across multiple states and, frequently, multiple countries. It requires reading adoption records, military service files, immigration documents, and church registries that were never digitized and exist only on microfilm in a county courthouse basement. It requires understanding DNA triangulation well enough to use genetic testing results as supporting evidence in a legal proceeding, not just as a hobby database match. I have been doing this for 11 years. I have closed 204 cases. I have testified as an expert witness in probate court 6 times. None of that information has ever made it past Does Ancestry stuff online at my family's table, and I stopped correcting the record around the same time I stopped expecting anyone to ask a follow-up question. I learned this work from a woman named Constance Reyes. Constance was 61 years old when I started as her research assistant straight out of graduate school. She had spent 30 years in this field, the kind of researcher other researchers called when a case got difficult enough that ordinary diligence wasn't going to crack it. She kept a brass-handled magnifying glass on her desk that had belonged to her own mentor, and she used to say that most people think this job is about finding people. It isn't. It's about finding the gaps in what a family thinks it already knows. The official record is never the whole record. Somebody, somewhere, decided what got written down and what didn't, and your entire job is figuring out who decided and why. She trained me for 4 years before she retired. She died 18 months ago of pancreatic cancer at 68 years old, and she left me that same brass-handled magnifying glass along with a complete set of her case files, going back 3 decades, organized in a way that only made sense once I understood she had been quietly cataloging not just solved cases, but unsolved anomalies, small inconsistencies she had noticed across the years that never resolved into anything, filed under a single label in her own handwriting on the box. Things that might matter later. I did not open that box for over a year after she died. I want to be honest about that. Grief made the box feel heavier than its actual weight, and I told myself I would get to it eventually. I got to it in November, for weeks after my grandfather's funeral, for reasons that had nothing to do with him at all. Marcus Whitlow's case file landed on my desk on a Tuesday morning in early November. The assignment was straightforward on its surface. A woman named Helen Pruitt had died in Columbia, South Carolina, without a will, leaving an estate valued at roughly $310,000 and no known living relatives that the county could locate. The state required a documented, exhaustive heir search before any unclaimed estate could pass to the state's general fund, and Marcus's firm had been retained to make sure that search was done properly. On behalf of a distant cousin who believed she might be entitled to a share but needed the full family tree professionally reconstructed to prove it. I built Helen Pruitt's family tree the way I build everyone. Starting with her own birth certificate, working outward through every marriage, divorce, and adoption record I could locate, cross-referencing against census data, military files, and, where the paper trail thinned out, DNA testing results from a regional genealogy database that several distant relatives, including my client, had already submitted samples to. Helen Pruitt's maternal grandmother, it turned out, had been born Eleanor Lane in 1931 in Florence County, South Carolina. Lane is not an uncommon surname in South Carolina. I want to be clear that I did not immediately assume any connection to my own family. What I did, because it is simply how the work is done, was trace Eleanor Lane's full sibling set, the way I would for any name in any case, to rule out or confirm whether any branch of her family connected meaningfully to Helen Pruitt's claim. Eleanor Lane had a younger brother. His name was Theodore Lane, born in 1941 in Florence County, South Carolina. My grandfather. I sat with that for a long moment before I did anything else. Not because it changed Helen Pruitt's case. It didn't. Eleanor Lane was a collateral relative with no bearing on the actual inheritance question. But because the professional instinct that has been trained into me for 11 years does not simply stop functioning the moment a familiar name appears in a record. If anything, it sharpens. I pulled my grandfather's full vital record history, the way I would for any subject, out of pure habit, the same habit that makes a structural engineer notice a hairline crack in a building they're not even being paid to inspect. What I found was a marriage record from 1962 in Marion County, South Carolina. Theodore Lane, age 21, married to a woman named Doris Calhoun, age 19. I had never heard the name Doris Calhoun in my entire life. My grandfather married my grandmother, Renata Vance, in 1968. 6 years separated those two marriages. And nowhere, in any conversation I had ever had with my father, my Aunt Pamela, or my grandfather himself across 34 years, had a first marriage ever come up. I want to pause here and tell you about Constance's box, because this is the moment it became relevant. I went home that night and opened it for the first time. Near the bottom, in a manila folder labeled Lane, Florence County, unresolved, I found notes in Constance's handwriting, dated 14 years earlier, from a case she had worked that, according to her own annotation, never went anywhere because the client lost interest and stopped paying for further research. The client's name was not familiar to me, but the subject of the research was. Constance had been hired, 14 years before her death, by a woman trying to locate her biological father. The woman's name was Margaret Calhoun. She had been born in 1963 in Marion County. Her mother was listed on her birth certificate as Doris Calhoun. Constance's notes ended with a single line, underlined twice. Possible father, Theodore Lane, Florence County. Marriage record confirms timeline. Client unable to fund DNA confirmation. Case closed, unresolved. Filed under things that might matter later. She had found this 14 years ago. She had filed it away, unsolved, unfunded, with no reason to ever connect it to me, because she had no idea Theodore Lane was my grandfather. I had never once mentioned his name to her in 4 years of training, because why would I have? He was just my grandfather. A man who built a construction supply company. A man everyone in my family described, proudly, as self-made. He was also, apparently, a man with a daughter nobody in my family had ever met. Margaret Calhoun had been impossible to fully trace back when Constance worked the case 14 years earlier, because the trail required exactly the kind of paid forensic work the original client couldn't afford. DNA confirmation against a living Lane relative, formal records requests across 2 counties, the kind of methodical, expensive labor that this profession actually requires and that my family has spent years describing as a hobby. I could afford it now. I had every tool Constance had lacked. And I had something else entirely. A professional obligation, the moment I recognized my own grandfather's name in an open file, to either pursue this properly or set it aside completely. Because there is no version of this work where you investigate your own family informally and call it research. I called Marcus Whitlow first, not about my family, but about the ethics of what I'd stumbled into. He has handled enough sensitive probate matters to understand immediately why I needed to talk it through before I touched another document. He said the situation was unusual, but not unprecedented. He said that if Theodore Lane's estate had not yet been formally closed, and if there was a documented possibility of an omitted heir, I had an obligation to pursue verification properly, through the same standards I would apply to any client, regardless of the personal connection. He said the alternative, knowing what I knew and doing nothing, created its own serious problem, both ethically and, depending on how the estate eventually closed, legally. My grandfather's estate had not yet closed. The probate process was still 6 weeks from finalizing distribution among his 3 legally recognized children, my father Richard, my Aunt Pamela, and my uncle Stephen. I had 6 weeks to find out whether Margaret Calhoun was real, whether she was still alive, and whether she had ever had children of her own who might now be entitled to a share of an estate my family believed was already fully accounted for. Margaret Calhoun had died in 2009, at age 46, in Wilmington, North Carolina. I confirmed that within 2 days, through a standard record search. She had never married Theodore Lane's name into her own life in any official capacity. There was no acknowledgement, no support order, nothing in any record suggesting my grandfather had ever known she existed, or that Doris Calhoun had ever told him. What Margaret Calhoun had, when she died, was a son. His name is Daniel Calhoun. He is 41 years old. He works as a high school chemistry teacher in Wilmington, North Carolina, and when I located him through public records and a careful, professionally worded letter explaining who I was and why I was reaching out, he had absolutely no idea his mother's biological father had been a wealthy South Carolina businessman who had just died 6 weeks earlier, leaving an estate currently being divided among 3 children who didn't know Daniel existed at all. I requested a DNA sample from Daniel through the same accredited lab I use for every contested heir case, and I requested a comparison sample from my own father, framed honestly, the way Marcus had advised, as part of a probate matter requiring family verification, without yet telling my father the full scope of what that verification was actually testing. The results came back in early December. Daniel Calhoun is my grandfather's biological grandson, through Margaret, with a confidence interval that left no meaningful room for dispute. Margaret Calhoun was Theodore Lane's biological daughter. Daniel Calhoun was, under South Carolina intestate succession law for the portion of the estate not covered by an explicit will provision, entitled to a share equal to what my father, my Aunt Pamela, and my Uncle Stephen were each receiving. A 4th child. Discovered 6 weeks before the estate closed, by the granddaughter whose career the family had spent a wedding rehearsal dinner laughing about. I told my father first, alone at his kitchen table, on a Sunday afternoon in mid-December. I walked him through everything. The Pruitt case. Audrey Lane. The 1962 marriage record to Doris Calhoun that none of us had ever known about. Constance's old, unresolved file. Margaret Calhoun's birth certificate. Her death in 2009. Daniel, the chemistry teacher in Wilmington, with a DNA match that left no room for argument. My father did not say much while I talked. He sat very still, the way people sit when they are absorbing something that requires them to quietly reorganize 60 years of assumptions about who their own father was. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he asked the only question that mattered to him in that moment, which was whether I was certain. Not whether I wanted this to be true. Whether the evidence actually held. I told him it held completely. Vital records, DNA confirmation, documentation chain, all of it built exactly the way I would build it for any client, because that is the only way I know how to build anything. He believed me immediately. That mattered to me more than I expected it to. Aunt Pamela did not believe me immediately. I want to walk you through exactly how that conversation went, because it is the part of this story that closes the loop on the wedding rehearsal dinner. We met at my father's house, the 4 siblings and myself, 2 days before Christmas, because the estate attorney needed a family decision on how to proceed before the holidays delayed everything into the new year. I presented the file the way I present any file, chronologically, with copies for everyone, starting with the marriage record and ending with the lab results. Pamela read perhaps half a page before she set it down. She said this was exactly the kind of thing that happens when someone spends their career digging through other people's family secrets for a living and starts seeing patterns that aren't actually there. She said I had built an entire career out of finding problems in families that didn't ask to be found, and that it would be just like me to manufacture one in my own family the moment the opportunity presented itself. I let that sit in the room for a moment before I answered. Then I said that I hadn't manufactured anything. I had been hired for an unrelated case by an attorney who had no idea Theodore Lane was my grandfather, and the discovery had happened entirely within the standard, documented process I use for every client I have ever worked with. The same process, I reminded her, that had closed 204 cases and survived 6 appearances as expert testimony in probate court. I told her that if she wanted to challenge the DNA results, the lab's accreditation was a matter of public record, and she was welcome to request independent retesting at her own expense, which is standard practice and which I would fully support, because nothing about this finding depends on anyone simply taking my word for it. She did not request retesting. What she did, instead, was retain her own attorney within the week to formally contest Daniel Calhoun's standing in the estate proceeding. The contest did not go the way Pamela hoped. Her attorney requested independent DNA verification, exactly as I had told her she was entitled to. The independent lab confirmed my findings within 3 weeks, with the same confidence interval, because the underlying biology does not change based on who is asking the question. Her attorney then argued, in a filing I read with the particular detachment of someone who has seen this argument fail many times before, that even with confirmed paternity, Daniel Calhoun's claim should be barred because Theodore Lane had never acknowledged Margaret Calhoun during his lifetime, and an unacknowledged biological relationship should not override the established expectations of his recognized children. South Carolina law does not work that way, and Marcus Whitlow's office made sure the probate judge understood exactly why, citing the relevant intestate succession statute, which recognizes a biological child's inheritance rights regardless of formal acknowledgement, provided paternity is established through clear and convincing evidence. The judge ruled in February. Daniel Calhoun was recognized as Theodore Lane's 4th legal heir, entitled to an equal quarter share of the portion of the estate subject to intestate succession. The judge's written ruling included a specific note, which Marcus read aloud to me over the phone because he knew it would matter to me, commending the unusually thorough and professionally documented research that had established the relationship conducted. The ruling specified, by a credentialed forensic genealogist whose methodology met every evidentiary standard the court required. The court did not know, when it wrote that the credentialed forensic genealogist was also the granddaughter whose entire family had spent a wedding rehearsal dinner describing her work as looking up dead people online. I met Daniel Calhoun in person for the first time in March, at a small diner in Wilmington, halfway between his home and mine. He is a quiet man, careful with his words, the kind of person who clearly spent a good portion of his life wondering about a family history nobody could ever tell him about, because the one person who might have known, his mother, had died believing she would never find the answer either. He asked me what Audrey Lane was like. I told him honestly. A hard-working man, a difficult one in certain ways, proud of what he built and not always generous about acknowledging what other people contributed to it. I did not tell him this to soften anything. I told him because Daniel deserved an honest answer rather than a flattering one, and because I have learned, across 11 years of doing this work, that the people who finally find the family they were looking for deserve the truth about who that family actually was, not a story built to make the discovery feel better. He said he appreciated that more than I probably understood. He said most of what he'd imagined about his biological grandfather, across 41 years of wondering, had been some version of a story, and it was strange and oddly settling to finally have facts instead. I understood exactly what he meant. I want to tell you what happened at Tessa's wedding, because the timing of all of this worked out in a way I did not plan and would not have chosen if I'd had the choice. The wedding was in April, 4 months after the rehearsal dinner where Pamela made her joke, and by then the entire family knew the full outcome of the estate proceeding, including the fact that Pamela's contest had failed completely and that her legal fees, which she had paid herself, had accomplished nothing beyond delaying a result that arrived exactly the way the evidence said it would. Pamela did not make any jokes about my career at the wedding. She did not say much to me at all, which I understood, and did not particularly need her to correct. What I want you to know is that I did not need an apology to feel like the matter had resolved. The resolution had already happened, in a courtroom, in a written ruling that specifically praised the rigor of work my family had spent years treating as something to laugh about at a dinner table. That ruling exists in the public record permanently. It will outlast any apology Pamela does or doesn't eventually decide to offer. Daniel attended the wedding, at Tessa's invitation, once she learned the full story and decided, on her own, that her newly discovered cousin should be part of the family gathering rather than a footnote to a legal proceeding. He sat at my table. We talked about his students, about the chemistry curriculum he was building for the spring semester, about how strange and good it felt, after 41 years, to finally have cousins who knew his name. Like they always say, the people who reduce your work to a punchline rarely understand that the precision they're laughing at is the exact precision that will eventually tell the truth about their own family, whether they want it told or not. I did not go looking for Audrey Lane's first marriage. I was working an unrelated case for a client who had no connection to my family at all. The discovery happened because I do my job the same careful, methodical way every single time, regardless of who's watching, regardless of whether anyone at a dinner table thinks it matters. Constance taught me that the official record is never the whole record. She filed away an unresolved anomaly 14 years ago under a single label, things that might matter later, with no way of knowing it would eventually involve her own student's family. It mattered later. It mattered enough to bring a man into our family who had spent 41 years wondering where he came from, and it mattered enough to prove, conclusively and on the public record, exactly what my work actually requires. My name is Audrey Lane. I am 34 years old. I am a forensic genealogist and certified air search researcher at Briarwood Genealogy and Probate Research in Charleston, South Carolina. I keep Constance's brass-handled magnifying glass on my own desk now, beside her complete case files, which I have finally finished organizing, 14 months after she left them to me. I have closed 205 cases. The 205th was my own family's, though I did not set out to make it so, and I did not need it to be. Daniel Calhoun calls occasionally, now, just to talk. Last month he asked if I would help him trace his mother's side of the family more fully, the side that has nothing to do with the Lanes at all. I told him I would, and that I wouldn't charge him for it, because some research isn't about the invoice. That is my story. One wedding joke. One unrelated case. One 14-year-old file labeled things that might matter later. And one quietly precise process that found a man's family for him, 41 years after he started wondering where it had gone. If this reminded you that the careful, unglamorous work you do is never actually a hobby, no matter how often someone laughs about it at dinner, share this with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment. Tell me what moment hit you hardest. Hit subscribe. And I will see you in the next one.